Well, you're in 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel, you should already have that open. Chapter 17. The first thing I want you to see about David's life is that he had a personal faith born of experience. A personal faith born of experience. David was a young man even at this point. Still young. But he'd been out tending his sheep, his father's sheep. And he'd learned some things under the stars. He'd learned some things out in the field. And these experiences of his had developed in him and given birth in him to a significant personal faith. It's the kind of faith you and I wish we had in our lives, isn't it? You remember the story. David's been caring for his dad's sheep. His older brothers are off doing battle against the Philistines under King Saul. Well, David is instructed to take some food to his brothers, which he does. When he gets to the battlefield, he discovers there is a giant, a large, very large Philistine taunting the armies of God. And no one is willing to go and fight the giant. So David's listening and watching and thinking, what's going on? In fact, he creates a bit of a ruckus. So he finds himself standing before the king, King Saul, who should have been out, by the way, dealing with the giant. But he wasn't. He was like the other Israelite soldiers. He was afraid. He didn't have the kind of faith that David had. So, chapter 17. We're going to pick up with verse 32. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant," that means I, "will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a boy, and he has been a fighting man from his youth." But David said to Saul, now listen to David's experience, and hear how David's experience gave birth to a personal faith in his life, the kind of faith you and I would like to have. But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine," he's kind of talking trash now to the enemy, "this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them. Why? Because he has defied the armies of the living God." Now, if this had been you and me or someone else, it's very possible that David might have said, "Let me just tell you about my resume here. Let me tell you what kind of great person you have. Yeah, I know I'm young, but let me just tell you, Saul, all the things I've done. Let me tell you what a great person I am." Now, while David did list his resume, he also gave us a little more insight into the experiences that he'd had while he was tending his father's sheep. Because it wasn't just that he'd been able to kill the lion and the bear. His experiences there with God, his experiences in the quiet moments, in prayer, in meditation. David had learned a very important lesson, and he identifies it in verse 37 when he says, the Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Now that is an amazing personal faith. That's the kind of faith you and I wish we had. But folks, it is born out of experience. And oftentimes those experiences come over years. It's not the type of faith that is born overnight. It comes from years of struggling as a Christian and finding failure in our lives, but overcoming and keeping moving and hanging on and staying in there with the Lord. And over time, God builds within us and develops within us a personal faith that is born out of experience. When I was young, when I was really young, really little, my mom was giving me a dime a week for allowance. Now that's back when a dime could buy something at TG&Y. Have you ever heard of TG&Y? Any of you know that? Ben Franklin? The dime store, we called it. And of that dime, every Sunday, my mom would send me to church and Sunday. Well, she would take me to Sunday school and church. And I'd have my little envelope. And out of my dime, I would put a penny out of my dime in that envelope. So as long as I can remember, I was being taught the value and the importance of tithing. It wasn't her penny I was giving. I wasn't getting 11 cents. I was getting a dime, and I was taking 1 penny of mine and giving it to the church. But in spite of that, over the years, I would tithe, but I would often struggle with it. I would often find myself sitting down to write that check and wonder, do I have the funds this time? I don't know if I can make ends meet this week or this month. The math just doesn't add up. Things just don't seem right, and I would struggle with this. Well, a few years ago, I was contemplating this and thinking about this, and it was as though I sort of turned a corner in my life. It's as though God said, Rick, just how old are you anyway? And I said, well, I'm as old as dirt. And he said, well, listen, think about this. Have I ever not provided for you financially? And I got to thinking about it. And I got to reflecting on my life all these years, over 50 years. And He's never failed to provide for me. So why would I begin to think that now, after all these years, what makes me think that somehow He's going to stop providing for me now? So I made a recommitment of my life to tithing. And even though I'd been a pretty consistent tither throughout my life, something happened. So here's what I did. Thanks to the advent of online banking, I went in and I set it up so that twice a month, on the 1st and on the 15th of every month, my bank writes a check for me and sends it to this church twice a month. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to struggle with it. I don't have to do the math. I don't have to fill out the envelope. I don't even have to the bank puts a stamp on the letter for me. It's fabulous. I don't have to think about it. But the victory didn't come because I have online banking. The victory came when in my heart and in my mind, I realized my experience tells me He isn't going to let me down. My experience tells me I can do this. He's provided for me before. He'll provide for me now. It's personal faith that is born out of experience. But those things don't happen overnight. The second thing I want you to see about David's life is a persistent sin. Persistent sin born of presumption. What? What? Yeah, let me say that again. Persistent sin born of presumption.